There are all kinds of shady and dangerous creatures lurking in the music industry. Since about the mid-20th century, the mob has found ways to extract money by getting involved in record labels, radio stations, artist management, and live music venues. Although things, thankfully, aren't what they used to be, the mob's involvement played a key part in the development of the music industry for decades. One of the key guys in all this ran a New York-based label called Roulette Records, which started in 1957. One of its co-founders was Morris Levy, who got his start in jazz clubs. At his peak, Levy headed 90 companies employing over 900 people. Music publishing, the independent record label game, running record stores, operating record pressing plants, tape duplicating facilities, artist management, and a music distribution company. They were all part of his empire. Some called him an entrepreneur. But the truth was that Morris, Mo or Moshe to his friends, and a few enemies, was a crook who controlled far more of the industry than people realized. And much of his business was connected to organized crime. He's gone now, but while he was alive, he was probably the most mobbed-up music man in history. A lot of people were ripped off for tens of millions of dollars, and more than one person got hurt. I'm Alan Cross, and this is episode 47 of Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. We're looking at Morris Levy, music's most mobbed-up man. Morris Levy was born in Harlem in 1927. His father and his brother died when he was very young, and his mother was very sickly. She suffered from such a severe case of lockjaw that she had to have her front teeth removed just so she could eat. Levy was a problem kid, especially at school. After a stint in juvenile detention, he dropped out at 13 and ran off to Florida, where he found jobs as a photographer on the local nightclub scene. That's one story anyway. He definitely figured out how to get contracts for running coat check rooms. By the time he was 14, he knew mob figures like Tommy Eboli, future head of the Genovese family. They were one of the 5 families who controlled New York, along with the Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo clans. We will get back to them. Levy joined the Navy in March 1945. He never saw any action in World War II and was eventually given an honorable discharge so he could look after his mother. When he got out, he moved back to New York, where he managed a jazz club called the Royal Roost. He later opened another place, a basement spot on 52nd Street, specializing in swing and bebop, called Birdland. That was 1949. He convinced a few of the mobster clients from his old club to invest in the purchasing of the space. Guys like Joe the Wop Cataldo, someone very well known to the FBI for his dealing in narcotics. Cataldo, and a few others, were his secret silent investors. Levy was just 19 years old. It wasn't long before New York cops opened a file on Levy. His dealings looked suspicious, but they could never quite pin anything on him. Birdland became one of the city's centers of jazz culture, featuring a multiracial lineup including Count Basie and Dizzy Gillespie. Admission was 98 cents, plus you had to buy a minimum number of drinks when you sat down at a table. Whites and blacks of all social classes and backgrounds mingled freely in the audience, making it one of the few non-segregated music venues in the city. It won a lot of praise for that. The MC was Pee Wee Marquette, who stood all of 3 feet 9 inches tall. Performers had to tip him before they went on stage, otherwise he'd deliberately mispronounce their names or do something else that would embarrass them. Starting in 1951, a DJ broadcast live from the club every Friday night starting at midnight. Birdland often drew capacity crowds, but struggled financially at first. Levy augmented his salary by running a bookie operation with a local horse race track. He also allegedly made mob friends by allowing Birdland to be used as a front for money laundering. It was during this time that Morris Levy discovered the value of music publishing. When an artist creates a song, there's also a deal with a publishing company, which is in charge of collecting all the royalties from performances of that song. The split between the artist and the publisher is usually somewhere around 50-50. At Birdland, Levy learned that nightclubs, along with radio stations and other platforms for the performance of music, had to pay an annual fee to ASCAP, a performing rights organization, for the privilege of doing so. Levy immediately understood how much money could be made in publishing, so he formed Patricia Music. a publishing company named after his first wife. He then set about acquiring the rights to songs. For example, remember the DJ I talked about? He commissioned a theme song for the radio broadcast, and he made sure he owned the rights to it. By ordering that the DJ played at least 4 times a night, he made a few pennies with each play. But over time, those pennies added up. It was called the Lullaby of Birdland, and was later covered by people such as Ella Fitzgerald and Sarah Vaughan.
Lullaby of Birdland, that's what I always hear when you sigh. Never in my wordland could there be ways to reveal.
Lullaby of Birdland, composed by George Shearing in about 10 minutes. It sold a quick 10,000 copies when it was issued in December 1955. It's now a jazz standard and has been covered by everyone from Quincy Jones to Mariah Carey to Amy Winehouse. Shearing got the composing rights, but Levy got the publishing. Levy became fascinated with this kind of passive income. He didn't have to do anything. The money just rolled in. That's why he founded his own company, Patricia Music. Together with his partner Neil Call, Levy started buying up the publishing rights to songs by small jazz labels, specifically songs that were performed at Birdland and recorded live. Levy's thinking was, look, I paid for these guys to perform and they played the song in my club, so I own the rights to the recording. Not exactly 100% legal, but the musicians weren't in much of a position to challenge him. Every time a song was performed, Levy got paid. And later, when these recordings were released as albums, he also got paid. Levy also wasn't above playing a musician's vulnerabilities. When Count Basie, the great big band leader, was drowning in gambling debts, Levy lent him money. And this ultimately meant that Basie never saw a dime from any of the recordings he made at Birdland with Levy. Levy opened a couple more nightclubs and restaurants, probably with the help of a few mob buddies like Frank Carbo. He controlled a big chunk of New York's boxing scene. He was also a convicted killer, and he had a connection to the mob group Murder Incorporated. Also on board was Johnny Bath Beach Otto, a captain in the Colombo family. This all brought in more publishing money. Wise guys were always hanging around Levy's places. On January 26, 1959, Levy's brother Irving was tending bar at Birdland when a customer got surly. Irving was stabbed, and he bled to death in the kitchen. Rumors swirled that the real target was supposed to have been Morris because, well, who knows? The killer, Lee Schlesinger, was a bad guy with a long record. Levy later liked to brag that he tracked down Schlesinger and, I quote, I took a knife and stuck it in his stomach until his guts fell out. Now, there's absolutely no evidence that this actually happened, but it became part of the Levy legend, a story that he trot out whenever someone came into his office looking to be paid. Levy also loved leveraging radio. By hiring local DJs to MC touring shows of Birdland performers, he could depend on them to play their records on the radio, thereby increasing his publishing income. This laid the groundwork for a network of Payola-taking DJs across the country that would later come in very handy. This network included a young DJ from Cleveland who had relocated to New York after becoming very successful playing R&B songs by black musicians for audiences consisting largely of white kids. And his name was Alan Freed. Freed brought his fast-talking DJ shtick to WINS in New York, calling himself Moondog and King of the Moondogs. But then he was sued by a blind New York street musician named Moondog, and he had to come up with another catchphrase. Freed adopted rock and roll, an African-American euphemism for sex. Any record played on Freed's radio show was referred to as a rock and roll song. Seeing an opportunity, Levy approached Freed with the idea of forming a corporation that would trademark the term rock and roll. If they were successful, anyone wanting to use it would have to pay them a license fee. But as the use of rock and roll spread throughout the language, Levy realized that they'd never have a chance of protecting such a trademark, so that idea was abandoned. Levy pushed out Freed's original manager, a guy named Lou Platt, by basically advising him that it was time to go, or else. Levy started managing Freed before handing him off to Tommy the Galoot Vestola, a member of a gang in New Jersey. We will come back to Vestola many times in this story. The Galoot was a big guy, allegedly capable of tearing a man apart with his bare hands. He was also involved in the family's control over prostitution, gambling, drugs, and loan sharking. He was also the second cousin of a music-loving mob guy named Dominic Ciafone, also known as Swats Mulligan, a soldier in the Genovese family who had ties to various unions, including the one that handled radio and TV people. He was well known to the NYPD, the FBI, and the IRS, and he was soon a presence in the Roulette offices. Together with Levy, they made plenty of money by underwriting Freed's live music events. Some of them grossed almost $200,000, an insane amount for the mid-1950s. These sold-out, riotous musical performances were a revelation for Morris Levy. There was money to be made from this new rock and roll thing, and the kids that bought the records and went to the shows. Levy was already a music publisher. He managed artists and tours. He ran nightclubs. So the only thing missing from this portfolio was a record label. A record label would allow him to control even more music. So that's what he did. And that's when he founded Roulette Records. And that label became his focus for the rest of his life. It was also the company that fleeced artists of tens of millions of dollars. Morris Levy had tried to establish a record label in the early 1950s, but the audience for the jazz records he was releasing wasn't big enough for it to survive. But this new rock and roll thing, well, that was different. Levy met George Goldner, who had a formula for making money from popular songs. He had an arrangement with labels that had him pay DJs to play specific records on the radio. He got record pressing plans to manufacture extra copies that he sold directly to distributors without the label's knowledge. He stiffed labels on payments, and he was very fond of Payola. Now, let's go to Miami. Roulette was a major sponsor of the infamous International Radio Programming and Disc Jockey Convention at the Americana Hotel in Miami. This was May 1959. It was covered in the local media as an event consisting of booze, bribes, and broads. That's a quote. Over 2,500 DJs from all over the United States attended. Levy was there to grease his payola wheels. He sponsored an all-night barbecue that consumed 2,000 bottles of bourbon. He rented a suite where DJs could gamble using fake money to win things like TVs, trips to Europe, and a new car. And it's funny how those who played never seemed to lose. This convention was so crooked that it attracted the attention of the U.S. government, which opened hearings into the payola problem. Those hearings ended up completely destroying Alan Freed. Levy, however, managed to skate, even though payola charges were brought against him. Levy did something else, too. In June 1961, he sent a letter to every program director and DJ in the country. They were invited to sign an affidavit confirming that they had never, ever received any kind of payola payment from Levy or Roulette. Few escaped noticing that this was a subtle way of threatening anyone who refused to sign. Levy had also stumbled on another idea. At a recording session by a doo-wop group called the Crows, he made a suggestion for the arrangement of a song called G, and for that, he claimed co-authorship of the recording and thus an additional part of the music publishing.
Love that oh, 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 gee, my oh, gee. Well, oh, oh, gee. Oh, I love that girl. Love that oh, 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 please.
The record became a hit, and Levy and his partner Goldner did quite well. But, plagued by a severe gambling addiction, Goldner eventually sold his copyright to a company called Meridian Music, which, yes, was another Morris Levy company. The first thing that Levy did, like I said, was include himself as an author of the song, which of course, like I said, he had very little to do with. Meanwhile, Goldner created a new record label called G after the song. His first signing was a group called the Cleftones, and when they paid a visit to the G offices, they were met by Morris Levy. He told them that the two big guys next to him in the office, Tommy the Galoot Vastola and another guy named Johnny Roberts, would be their managers. Oh, and for the privilege of having the Galoot to be their manager, he was going to be credited as a co-author for the Cleftones song You Baby You. This was all part of a growing scheme whereby Levy would purchase a piece of a struggling record label, loan the original owner money at an insane interest rate, and then swallow up the entire operation when payments couldn't be made, thereby acquiring the publishing rights to all the songs on that label. This is exactly how the mob worked when they wanted to take over a legitimate business. G, now partly owned by Levy, signed a group called the Premiers. The youngest member of the group was a 13-year-old named Frankie Lyman. The kid was obviously a star. Goldner changed the name of the group to The Teenagers with Frankie Lyman. And in 1956, their debut single, once called Why Do the Birds Sing So Gay, was retitled Why Do Fools Fall in Love? It sold 100,000 copies in just 3 weeks.
Why do birds sing so gay? And love is the way to say to say. Why do they fall in love? Why does
That song was a monster, ascending high in the charts in America and the UK. Goldner, realizing that he had a huge hit on his hands, quietly dropped co-writer Herman Santiago's name from the credit on the label, and he also left Santiago's name off the copyright registration. So now the song was being credited to Lyman Goldner. Morris Levy was most interested in this sleight of hand, which he used when Roulette Records came online in early 1957. He exerted just the right kind of pressure on Goldner, and he was able to buy G, like we mentioned, along with 2 other labels, Rama and Tico. They were now Levy's property. And again, all the publishing now belonged to Levy. Later reissues and versions of Why Do Fools Fall in Love were then credited to Lyman Levy, not Lyman Goldner or Lyman Santiago. There were partners in this new label, Roulette. That included George Goldner and Alan Freed, but they were quickly squeezed out. Actually, Goldner squeezed himself out thanks to all those gambling habits and gambling debts. But because Levy had the foresight to hire a couple of sharp music guys, Roulette started having hits. Ronnie Hawkins, Buddy Knox, Jimmy Rogers, Pearl Bailey, Dinah Washington, and Count Basie. How were they hits? Well, Payola was a big part of it, of course. Levy and his underlings bribed DJs to play Roulette Records with money, alcohol, drugs, and women, whatever it took. Singer Joey D recalled going around to various radio stations in a limo. With them would be a couple of hookers. They'd meet a DJ, hand over an envelope of cash, and then leave him alone in the limo with the ladies. These tactics made it easy to get a song on the radio. And once a song was on the radio, it started to sell. And every sale put more publishing dollars in Morris Levy's pocket. But if the bribes and women didn't work, as one witness put it, that's when the baseball bats came out. And worse. While some bigger labels like RCA bought up indie companies, Levy held on to Roulette. And when an act was signed, Levy made sure that his name was on the copyright registration for publishing purposes. Now, some context is required here. In the late 1950s, rock and roll and pop records were seen as disposable, inconsequential stuff. It was a fad. And no one believed that this fad had any chance at longevity, so the music was treated accordingly. Many artists were happy to give up their copyrights for a one-time payment because, well, hey, that's probably the most their record would ever generate, right? Now, this doesn't make Levy's shady securing of copyrights any less shady and immoral, but it does give us an idea as to why so many of these early rock and roll, pop, and R&B acts would part with their music for so little. On top of this, Levy didn't like paying his artists when they were legitimately owned royalties. He never accurately counted record sales. For example, when a group called Buddy Knox and the Rhythm Orchids sold 1.2 million copies of one song and nearly 1 million of another, they expected some big checks. Instead, Levy would say something like, "You want royalties? Then go to England." Had they read their Roulette contract, they would have found that they gave Levy control over their record, publishing, management, and agency. All they got was a paltry advance of $8,000. Any attempts to address the situation with the musicians' union and by hiring lawyers went nowhere. When bass player Jimmy Bowen showed up at the Roulette offices himself, he was confronted by Levy, the Galoot, and someone named Sonny, probably John Francese of the Colombo crime family. Bowen left with nothing. Meanwhile, Levy walked away with at least $400,000 in publishing for this 1957 hit.
Come along, be my party down.
Levy's argument was this. He signed the group. He spent money on the group. He owned the songs. Few roulette artists managed to get any kind of financial justice for as long as Morris Levy was alive. Regular royalty statements were rare, and there were strange dealings involving the number of records pressed, the number of copies given away for free, and the mysterious breakage clause, which covered records that were damaged during shipping. No one wanted to fight Levy because of his reputation and his connections. Comedy albums became a big deal. You might remember Bill Dana, who was famous for portraying a scared Mexican astronaut named Jose Jimenez.
The gentleman you're about to meet could possibly be the most important man in any of our lives. He's the United States Air Force officer who has been chosen to be the first man sent into outer space. I'm referring to the chief astronaut with the United States Interplanetary Expeditionary Force, and here he is now. How do you do, sir? May we have your name?
My name, Jose Jimenez.
And you're the chief astronaut with the United States Interplanetary Expeditionary Force?
I am the chief astronaut. With the United States in the planetary. But my name, Jose Jimenez.
Mr. Jimenez, could you tell us a little about your spacesuit?
It's very uncomfortable.
I've been noticing this, Mr. Jimenez. What is this called? A crash helmet?
Oh, I hope not.
One day, Dana was walking down Broadway, and there, in a record store, was a window display featuring an album called My Name, Jose Jimenez. It was the first he'd heard of this. It was a Roulette release. Levy had acquired some of Dana's live comedy club recordings and just put out a record without his permission. Jimmy Rogers found out the kind of hardball Levy liked to play with this single, which was released on Roulette. When he finally sued in 1988, Roulette claimed that even though the record went gold and was a #1 hit in America and Canada, they spent $26,000 to promote the song and only recouped $20,000 in royalty. So that meant, after 3 decades, Roulette said that Jimmy Rogers owed them $6,000.
Honeycomb, well, honeycomb, I want you to be my baby. Well, a honeycomb be my own. What a darn good life when you got a wife like a honeycomb. Honeycomb.
There's more to the Jimmy Rogers story, too, and it may or may not be linked to Morris Levy. On December 1st, 1967, Rogers had a run-in with an off-duty cop who had pulled him over. The cop says that when Rogers got out of the car, he stumbled and fell and fractured his skull. Rogers remembers it differently. He says he was beaten by this officer and 2 others who had raced to the scene. When the beating was over, they just left Rogers unconscious inside the car. He recovered enough to sue and won $200,000, but he never properly recovered from his head injuries. The beating led to a condition known as spasmodic diphonia, meaning that Jimmy Rogers lost his voice. Some people believe that this assault was somehow connected to Rogers' attempts to get Morris Levy and Roulette to pay him what he was owed. Rogers had hired an accountant to look at things, and he returned to Rogers saying, "Roulette probably owes you about $1 million, but the label keeps so many different sets of books that it's impossible to untangle everything." People were genuinely afraid to visit the Roulette offices because they didn't know what would happen to them. Mob guys were always hanging around. The accountant was known as Johnny Dio, a member of the Lucchese family. And if Morris wanted to avoid you, there was always the back door to his office and a private elevator for escape. One day, the songwriter Doc Pomus was summoned by Levy to Roulette. He needed some hit songs for his artists, and Pomus might be the guy to provide them. As he was waiting to be seen in the reception area, Levy's office door was open. He saw 2 giant guys take turns beating someone into a bloody pulp. After they were done, this poor soul was dragged out of the offices and thrown on the elevator. There's another story about the English manager Simon Napier Bell. He'd heard that Morris was connected, but didn't give that serious thought. He also witnessed someone getting roughed up, apparently for the crime of not being able to deliver a hit record. A producer named Bob Krasno flew in from the West Coast to demand the money he was owed. When he confronted Levy, Morris pulled a .38 out of the desk drawer and said, "I'll give you 5 seconds to get out of this office, or I'll blow your brains all over the carpet." In 1961, the FBI quietly launched an investigation into Roulette. They interviewed as many Levy associates as they could in hopes of determining if the label was, in fact, a front for the mob. One mentioned an associate whose job seemed to be giving people quick physical beatings. That was probably Tommy the Galoot Vestola. In another case, Levy called in someone who was importing records from Puerto Rico to get around Levy's ownership of those releases in America. He was essentially bootlegging some of Levy's bootlegs. He was only allowed to leave with 2 intact kneecaps when the guy gave up his partner's name. He got off easy. According to singer Tommy James, and we'll get to him a little later, Levy employed a man named Big Nate McCullough, who works as, let's just call him a collections expert, whose official title was Vice President of Roulette. If there was an unpaid bill to Roulette, McCullough would pay that vendor a visit. Baseball bats were his thing. But there's also the alleged incident of a Boston record dealer who was threatened with, get this, a mace and chain. As the 1960s went on, the IRS took more of an interest in Levy and Roulette too. Levy not only controlled Roulette, but a very complex web of companies, at least 30 of them, involving record production, artist management, and publishing. And it's funny how none of them ever seemed to report any meaningful income. The investigation later resulted in a settlement for unpaid taxes. But Levy kept rolling, and things were only going to get stranger and more violent. For all of Roulette Records' alleged mob connections, the label seemed to struggle financially. And this wasn't some cooking of the books scheme. Roulette really hurt for revenue. Levy took out a lot of bank loans and attempted to sell the company several times. At one point, the FBI determined that Roulette owed more than $850,000 to banks. This debt problem is sometimes used as a defense against the supposed mafia connections. If Levy were truly connected, the theory went, well, then the mob would help him out. But that didn't seem to be happening. Truth be told, Levy and Roulette were saved by Tommy James, this kid from Ohio, who had a regional hit with this song.
My baby does the hanky-panky. Yeah, my baby does the hanky-panky. Hey, my baby does the hanky-panky. My baby does the hanky-panky.
Through a very roundabout way, Tommy James landed on Morris Levy's radar. Once he heard the song, he let it known to all the record labels in New York that they were not to touch this kid. "This is my record," he told everyone, including the big majors. It was sheer intimidation, and everyone backed off. This meant that the only label to which James could sign was Roulette. Tommy James had an incredible run on Roulette. Hanky Panky was a #1 hit, pushing the Beatles' Paperback Writer out of the top spot on the charts. Other hits followed. I Think We're Alone Now, Crimson and Clover, Crystal Blue Persuasion, and this one. Morris Levy was relentless in his promotion of Tommy James. Prior to the release of a greatest hits album, Levy flew 28 distributors out to Las Vegas for a wild weekend of gambling and drinking. At the end of the weekend, he went up to each one of them. "You're taking 200,000 copies of this album. Same with you. You're taking 100,000. And that's how it went for all 28 of his guests. And no one said no. As for Tommy James, he knew he was in deep. At one meeting in Morris's office, he was introduced to Vinny the Chin Gigante, a high-ranking member of that family. Then he shook the hand of Fat Tony Salerno, who ran New Jersey for the Genovese family. And next to him was an ex-boxer named Quiet Don Cirillo, a capo with the Gigantes. Levy addressed the group. "He's a good kid. He's got a #1 record this week." Nope, not intimidating at all. The hits for Tommy James kept coming until early 1970. James, however, already strung out on drugs, collapsed during a concert and was initially pronounced dead. He retired to the countryside to recuperate. Then the New York mob wars broke out. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Levy, afraid that James might be the target of some kind of kidnapping or extortion plan, advised him to get out of town until things blew over. And that's when James opted for the countryside. He went to Nashville. Things did calm down, and there were a few more releases on Roulette, but he was allowed out of his contract in 1974. Now, you would think that with 5 top 10 hits and a series of best-selling albums, that James would be swimming in cash by now. Well, no. He was never able to get any concrete numbers from Morris about how much revenue his records generated. He got almost nothing. Many years later, in 2010, long after Levy was dead, James would publish a memoir called Me, the Mob, and Music, in which he told all his Morris Levy stories, including how he was stiffed for between $30 and $40 million in royalties. Where did that money go? To Morris Levy. It wasn't until the remnants of Levy's empire were sold off after his death that James started to receive the royalties he deserved. Someone who was probably involved in siphoning away all this money was Tommy Eboli, a high-ranking member of the Genovese family. We've already mentioned him. He joined Roulette sometime in the late 1960s, and we're going to talk more about him, but for now, let's just say that his presence at Roulette connected Levy even more to the Genovese family. Now, the mob wars. In 1969, Vito Genovese, the head of the family, died in prison. This created a power vacuum amongst New York's 5 families. Things heated up in June 1971 when Joe Colombo, the head of that family, was shot and paralyzed in front of thousands of people gathered for a rally of his Italian-American Civil Rights League, an organization designed to debunk the whole idea of there being a mafia in the first place. In April 1972, Crazy Joe Gallo, a captain in the Colombo family, was shot to death in retaliation over a dinner at Umberto's Clam House. There were other low-level assassinations too. By this time, Morris Levy was feeling the heat, so he and Nate McCalla, his collections guy, just disappeared for 6 months. They went to Spain. Morris knew that this mob war was bad and that his connections to the Genovese family put him on the wrong side. And it was at this time he told Tommy James to get out of town. While he was in Spain for those 6 months, Tommy Eboli, now the front boss of the Genovese family, was the victim of a gangland hit. On July 16, 1972, Eboli was shot dead outside his girlfriend's house in Brooklyn by an unknown gunman who drove past the place in a chauffeured Cadillac. His death was probably ordered by Carlo Gambino, perhaps over a loan that was supposed to go to a drug trafficking operation. Or maybe Carlos just wanted him rubbed out for his own reasons. Then, after the Eboli hit, Morris Levy felt safe enough to go back to New York. He was shaken by that murder, because not only had they been friends, but Eboli was his connection to the Genovese family, which offered him protection. The FBI paid a visit, but Levy insisted he knew nothing about Eboli's criminal activities and that he himself had nothing to do with the mob. For a while, Levy was a suspect in the murder, but there was no evidence, so that idea was dropped. Meanwhile, Vinny the Chin Gigante started taking more of an interest in Morris and Roulette. He would become an important figure in the company's future. Even afterwards, and with all this mob trouble, Levy kept on being Levy. Tens of millions of dollars that should have gone to artists and songwriters didn't. There was more payola and a scam involving surplus records known as cutouts. There were assaults, there were murders, and an insane situation involving, of all people, John Lennon. So the question was, within the music industry, could Morris Levy be stopped? We'll find out next time on part 2 of Morris Levy, music's most mobbed up man. You can catch up on all episodes of Uncharted by downloading them from your favorite podcast platform. They're all free for the taking. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear on this podcast, email me at alan@alancross.ca. We can also meet up on all the social media sites, along with my website, ajournalofmusicalthings.com, which is updated with music news and recommendations every day. It comes with a free daily newsletter filled with music news, opinion, and music recommendations. And there's my other podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music and alternative music through the decades. There are hundreds and hundreds of episodes that you can enjoy, all for free. See you next time for more stories of crime and mayhem in the music industry. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.